USS Indianapolis, which is approximately 85% complete, represents our latest ideas in the design of cruisers coming within the limit of 10,000 tons imposed by treaties limiting naval armaments. The ship, in addition, will carry airplanes and is provided with catapults for launching the planes and a crane for picking up the planes upon their return to the ship.
With her great speed and her sleek looks, the Indy quickly established herself as a prestige ship, and President Franklin Roosevelt chose her as his personal favorite for long-range trips of state. With FDR aboard, she sailed into New York Harbor in 1934 as the flagship of the combined fleet. She had become literally the ship of state, but figuratively was the symbol of a dynamic country in search of a new destiny as a world leader. She took many important people on goodwill missions throughout the 30s, but on December 7th, 1941, the goodwill ended. With the Japanese surprise attack in Pearl Harbor, the Indy became a fighting ship. Early on, she fought in the South Pacific, but was later sent north to the brutal and turbulent waters of the Bering Sea. On November 18th, 1944, a new man came aboard the illustrious ship. His name was Charles McVay, and he was the new captain. In 1944 and 45, with McVay in command, the Indy participated in the victories at Saipan in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The Pacific had become a cauldron of naval engagements, and the frenzied kamikaze attacks by the Japanese had destroyed many U.S. warships and killed thousands. On the morning of March 31st, 1945, a kamikaze broke through the clouds, penetrated a dense wall of flak, and crashed into the afterdeck of the Indy. 9 men were killed and 26 were injured. The dead were laid to rest at the mountainous island of Coramaretto, after which the Indy limped back to Mare Island Naval Yard near San Francisco to undergo extensive repairs. As the repairs on the ship were speeding along, so was the work in the Manhattan Project. The first uranium atomic bomb was being assembled at a laboratory in Los Alamos under the direction of Robert Oppenheimer. He and the project's military director, General Leslie Groves, directed that the Indianapolis would transport the components for the Hiroshima bomb to the Pacific island of Tinian. McVay was never told what he would be transporting, but everyone knew it was important.
The crates that held the parts to the atomic bomb were hoisted aboard, and what nobody noticed was at the same time the officers in charge of an important part of the bomb grabbed a couple of sailors and they carried it up to the stateroom of the 2 Army officers that were the couriers for it.
The important part that Redmayne referred to was the bomb's uranium-235 core, which was carried in a black-leaded cylinder, which was then welded to the deck in the Admiral's cabin. The bomb was loaded onto the Indy in the early morning hours of July 16, 1945. At that exact moment, as the sun was rising over the naval yard, it was also setting on the conventional age. The very first atomic bomb exploded in the New Mexico desert, ushering in the nuclear age and ushering the Indianapolis away from San Francisco toward its destiny in the Philippine Sea. In his room, McVay pored over the orders for his shipment. As he pondered over their significance and possible implications, another ship was complying with its orders 7,000 miles away. It was the Japanese submarine I-58, the inevitable instrument of the Indy's doom. The I-58 was the largest and most technically advanced of a new generation of Japanese submarine. Her orders had been to patrol the waters east of the Philippines and find, and if possible sink, enemy shipping. A successful sinking would mean a last gesture of glory for a dying Imperial Japan. On July 26th, the Indy finally dropped anchor in Tinian Harbor, and the bomb parts were offloaded as a very large group of admirals and brass looked on. Within a few hours, the Indy was steaming away from Tinian toward the island of Guam. Guam was the location of SINCPAC, which was Admiral Nimitz's command headquarters and where McVeigh was to receive his new orders. He and navigator John Janney got new orders and routing instructions to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. They were to join up with the flagship Idaho for 16 days of gunnery practice. But the Idaho received only a garbled message and never asked for a retransmission, and thus never even knew that the Indy was coming. 5 days before this, the U.S. destroyer Underhill was torpedoed in the vicinity of where the Indy would sink. It split in half and 119 men died. Incredibly, this important fact was never mentioned in the report to McVeigh, and neither were the reports of the latest positions of enemy submarines. This was the beginning of a fateful series of miscommunications that would seal the fate of the Indy. It had been suggested in Guam that she chart her course in a zigzag pattern. Zigzagging was used by unescorted combat vessels and was designed to help thwart submarine attacks, but it was rarely effective and therefore could be used at the captain's discretion. On board the big cruiser, the men performed their tasks and looked at their instruments, but there was no sign of approaching danger. The only activity was from below decks, where there was a routine change of shifts, and the only sound was from the thumping of the engines. It was now midnight, and the two ships slid quietly through the sea in a shimmery dance of death. The first torpedo blew off the bow, but the second one hit the magazine. The second explosion had a devastating effect, and everywhere men were burned and maimed, and sailors rushed through the ship. The explosions had cut off power, and so communications were dead and no radio signal could be sent. An abandoned ship could not be sounded. But two of the engines continued to turn, even as the ship was lumbering over onto its side. Because the ship had swallowed so much water, most of the fires and smoke were put out, but there were now only minutes left. At approximately 12:18, the Indy made a deep shudder and slid straight down to her silent, watery grave. When the Indianapolis went down that Sunday night, the 800 or so men who initially escaped were all alone in this vast ocean, because no distress signal had been sent. They had neither food nor water, and only a few of them were in rafts, while the rest had only Kapok life jackets. For the next 5 days, it would be the quintessential struggle of man against nature. Meanwhile, the Indy had been due in port in Leyte Gulf early Tuesday morning. When she didn't show up, she was simply taken off the plotting board. The port at Leyte was then the largest in the world, and her non-arrival was not noticed in the communication centers at Leyte headquarters. On Monday, the men received visitors. Schools of hungry sharks began cruising and turned a dangerous situation into a terrifying one. When the sharks challenged one of the groups, the men would slap the water and yell, and sometimes the shark would swim away, but sometimes it wouldn't. Because of the relentless attacks by the sharks, an atmosphere of fright became a constant factor. This, together with a lack of food and water, made the men delirious, and paranoid delusions were the result. They accused one another of being Japanese spies or of hoarding water, Fistfights broke out in the ocean, and many of the men were even stabbed to death. The Ventura PV-1 bomber was a medium-range plane that specialized in submarine hunting. A Ventura squadron was based on the island of Peleliu, some 300 miles south of where the Indy had sunk. 24-year-old Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was at the controls of his PV-1 at about 11 a.m. Thursday morning on a routine patrol in the Philippine Sea. While trying to fix a radio antenna problem, he casually glanced down at the water and thus changed the fate of 316 men. What he saw was a large oil slick from where the Indy had sunk. Curious, he dropped down for a closer look. And there they were, hundreds of delirious men. Immediately, he radioed Peleliu, and a Catalina seaplane was sent to investigate. At its controls was a 28-year-old lawyer from Frankfort, Indiana, named Adrian Marks, and he immediately dropped life rafts to the men below. The rescue effort had swung into full gear, with the destroyers Ringnes, Bassett, and Cecil Doyle picking up most of the men. The Navy was shocked at the dimensions of the disaster. There were 316 survivors, while 880 had died. No one knows how many were shark victims, perhaps hundreds, but the rescue ships found the remains of almost 100 mutilated bodies. When the survivors were picked up, they were dehydrated and covered with blisters, saltwater ulcers, and burns. For the men, it was finally the end of a nightmare. Back on Guam, Sinpak cameramen recorded the arrival of survivors as they gratefully debarked from planes, astonished that they were still alive.